Welcome back. My name is Chris, and in this video, we're going to take a look at manufacturing in NetSuite. Now, for people that have worked in the manufacturing industry their whole lives, these people tend to know these things inside and out. But for anyone that's relatively new to manufacturing, I think it's very important to understand the three main paths that you can go down when dealing with manufacturing in NetSuite. So to first just establish things, I'm going to pull up a sort of a chart here that we can look at. And to begin, I think it's best to start with the second path, which is referred to as WIP, also known as work in process or work in progress. And the WIP system, to just talk in general terms, WIP is a more complex system. There's definitely more features and intricacy to the system. It's best used when you're making things that can't just be made very quickly. They take longer and they're more involved in the production. So for example, if you were making a car, it's not like you can turn around and produce the car. You have to make the frame, then you make the engine and put it in the frame. There's the interior, there's the paint job. There's all of these different elements, and it might take weeks to produce this thing. It could be cars, radiators. Electronics also is very common because there's intricate parts, and you want to have close tracking for the cost that's involved in the manufacturing and just where it stands on the production line. So that is WIP. And of course, alongside the benefits that WIP has, you then get the downsides of more manpower to keep the system up to date. It's more expensive, harder to implement, etc. So that's the second path. Then you can take a look at the first path, which is non-WIP. So that's basically where you're using the simplest approach that NetSuite has to handle your manufacturing. That's really where you say in the system that you intend to produce something and then suddenly it is produced. It's a very simple approach. It's easy to understand, and it's best used for things that can be produced very rapidly. So if you have simple or easy to produce objects that can be done within a day or in a very short period of time, the non-WIP system tends to work best. And of course, it has the added benefit that it's cheaper to install and implement, and it doesn't take as much work or complexity to keep it up to date. Then you have the third path, which you could call the outsourced manufacturing path. That's where, regardless of how complex the manufacturing process is, it's all being done at an external location, not your own facilities. So you're simply recording that you intend to produce something, and then it does get manufactured at the exterior location, and you now show that in your NetSuite system. There are subtle differences with the outsourced manufacturing because you have to often send raw materials to that manufacturer, and then often those finished goods have to come back to you before they will end up going to the customer. There can be variations on that, but in general, the process for outsourced manufacturing is very similar to path number one, the non-WIP path. Outsourced manufacturing, that can be used for a lot of different things, but often used for food and beverage or for health and beauty like cosmetics. They commonly will manufacture at an exterior location. So those are our three paths, and that can give a framework of what we're dealing with, because depending on the path that you want to go down, the system and the setup can be very different, and the terminology that you use. And in this particular video, I'm going to focus on path number one, which is the simplest path and really the foundation of everything else. So before I actually dive into how this works in the system, I also want to point out that manufacturing is really tied at the hip with inventory management, because you need the raw materials and the components, and also your finished goods will be stocked and then shipped out to your clients. So much of that is really tied in with inventory management. And while I am going to be coming out in a few weeks with a manufacturing course, I already have an inventory management course in existence. So if you want to start diving into that, or even prep yourself for the eventual manufacturing course, the inventory management course is almost a must watch to be able to understand the things you're going to see in the manufacturing course. So with all of that in mind, let's now take a look at that first path, non-WIP in NetSuite. The first thing that you really need to take a look at when you're talking about manufacturing is the item records themselves. So let's come over here to List, Accounting, and then you can see we have items here. So let's create a new item and just see what the possibilities are. So we've got this list of all these various items, and while in the inventory management course, I really go into detail on all the various types of items, there's really just a few that are directly applicable to manufacturing. First off, you have inventory items. So those are going to be your components. Those are the things that go into making your finished product. And for the sake of this video, let's say that what we're trying to produce is a cake, or even a particular kind of cake. Let's say it's a carrot cake. So our inventory item might be eggs, you could have batter, you could have sugar, icing, all of these things would be inventory items. And specifically with inventory items, you have the capability to track them. So if you use 3 eggs, you can track that 3 eggs were used. Then you have non-inventory items. So those are also components that could go into your final cake, but they're things that would not be tracked. So for example, if you had decorative flowers or a decorative candle that goes on all of your cakes, you might have these in a little bucket and you simply pick them out. Those would be counted as non-inventory items. Then you have other charge. These are just important to pay attention with, even though they're not physical items that will be used in manufacturing. Other charges are very commonly attached to something to show tax fees, any kind of import charges, any of these additional fees or charges that you want to associate with an item. They would be attached as an other charge. And then of course you have an assembly item. That is the assembled item that comes from other components. So in this case, our assembly item would be our cake. But you should keep in mind that an assembly item could also be what's called a sub-assembly item. For example, batter might be an assembly item that was made using flour, sugar, eggs, and they all came together in batter, and then batter got used to make our final cake. So both of those could be assembly items. So the final assembly item can be composed of inventory, non-inventory, and other assembly items combined together. So that's a general concept of some key item types. Let's open up an assembly item and dig a little further into this. I'm not going to go through all the various fields that you can see here, but I'm going to touch on a few that are very important to understand, specifically in relation to manufacturing. And first up, we have the units of measure. If I scroll down here, you can see units of measure right here. And this is where you're simply measuring what does this item come in? Does it come in feet or yards, or for cakes, it would be eaches, meaning each cake. And let's actually take a slightly different example, because cakes are very simple, it's just eaches. But if you were making liquid chemicals, for example, you might purchase it in gallons, you might stock it in quarts, you might sell it in ounces. You've got all these different options. What's really important about units of measure when you're talking about manufacturing is if you are manufacturing, let's say, liquid chemicals, you want to make sure that whatever is set here as the base unit, that's what you intend to produce this thing in. So if you want to make liquid chemicals by the gallon, you want to make sure that base unit is set as gallons. If it accidentally or by whatever means you put it as quarts or ounces, when you go through the manufacturing process, the system is going to think and lock you in at making the liquid chemicals in quarts or ounces as opposed to what you want, which is making it in gallons. So you just need to keep that in mind. And moving down from that, we've got a number of different things here in purchasing and inventory tab. Again, so much of this I've covered in detail in my inventory management course. So I'm not going to go deep into this, but I want to point out a couple things. First off, you have the replenishment method. So this is something that is very important because it ties into how you're getting your components to make whatever assembly items you want. There's 2 most commonly used replenishment methods. That's reorder points and material requirements planning, also known as MRP. I'm coming out with a separate course just on MRP because it also is quite complex. And then of course, reorder points is a simpler system to understand. It's one that I talk about at length in the inventory management course. Master production scheduling is something that is almost never used by clients for various reasons that I've gotten into before. And time phased, although sometimes used, it tends to have an element that can also be utilized in MRP. So a lot of clients, instead of going with time phased, they tend to just lean on MRP as their preferred method of replenishment. So picking reorder points there. We've got additional things down here. For example, we can get into our reorder points or time phase down at the bottom here, but again, not particularly relevant to what I want to talk about for manufacturing. Same thing with sales and pricing. The pricing matrix at the bottom here, I've talked about in other videos, not necessary for this use. We're going to come now over to manufacturing. So this is where we can see what are the bill of materials that gets used for the production of this item. In this particular case, we're talking about our cake is our assembly item. So what is that bill of materials for the cake? Now, if you're not familiar with the bill of materials, this is a commonly used term in any manufacturing industry. The bill of materials is considered basically like an ingredient list, almost like you had a sheet of paper saying 3 eggs, 1 pound of flour, et cetera, et cetera. That would be your bill of materials. Now in NetSuite, it's actually a little bit different because they break it out in terms of its structure. So to show that, let's actually take a look at a bill of materials. I'm going to come up here. We're going to go to lists, supply chain, and you can see bill of materials here. If I click on that, we'll leave the current page. We have this long list here of all these various bills of materials, also known as BOMs. So let's select just the top BOM that we have here. This is BOM number 1. And if I select that, it brings us to this BOM. Now, this is really just kind of limiting what does this BOM relate to, what can it interact with. But most importantly, we come down here, you can see this revision. So BOMs in NetSuite have revisions. And the best way to think about this is instead of thinking about the BOM like you do in most industries where the BOM is literally the sheet of paper, that ingredients list we talked about, it's better to think of the BOM record as a container. And when you open up the container, inside you'll find your ingredients list, and that sheet of paper is called a revision. So every BOM should have at least one revision because that is the ingredient list for that BOM. Now, if maybe months down the line, you decide that you want to change the ingredient list from 2 eggs up to 3 eggs, then you would make a second revision. So that would be, let's say, revision 2, or in this case, it'd probably be called revision B. And that would be the most up-to-date or in effect revision. And that would be your newest, most up-to-date ingredient sheet. The BOM is simply the container that can hold as many revision sheets as you want. So that is the best way to think about that. Now let's open up this revision so we can understand what goes into this ingredients list. So I'm going to open this out a little further. So you can see in this revision A, we have 3 components that are on our ingredients list. And you can see the item name is here. There's a description here. And then here we get into component yield, BOM quantity, and quantity. And the best way to think about this is, let's assume for a second here that one of these items is the icing on our cake. When you're putting icing, right, you're doing decorative icing on your cake, the way that you basically deliver that is it comes in these tubes and you squeeze it out over the edges of your cake. It's decorative icing. So when you do that, sometimes the icing doesn't properly stick to the cake or you do it wrong and it falls off. So there's a certain amount of icing in any cake that has to be scrapped. So the best way to think about this is there's a certain amount of icing that you're gonna need to make the cake, and then there's a certain amount of icing that's gonna end up on the cake. So let's say, for example, that it takes 4 tubes of icing just to make a cake that really only ends up having 3 tubes of icing on it. What you'd have in that case is that your component yield here would be 75%, and you'd have a BOM quantity of 3 and a quantity of 4. So the quantity shows how many tubes of icing you had to really expend just to make the cake. Only 3 tubes really made it on the cake. You've got a 75% component yield. And then you can see on the far right, you've got units. So each of these component units are being used as eaches. Again, if you're using chemicals in liquid form, that might be gallons or might be quarts. And then the item source is simply saying, where is this component coming from? Do we have it in stock? Maybe we need a purchase order just to get that item in the first place so we can add it to our cake. So with all that in mind, we can close this revision. We didn't make any changes. So now that we understand BOMs and revisions, and we have the concept of the various items required in the manufacturing process, now we can start to take a look at the manufacturing process itself. As I mentioned earlier in this video, that first path is very straightforward. It's really only 2 records in the flow. It starts with a work order, and then it goes over to an assembly build. That's it, just those two records. Now, a work order, very similar to a sales order or a purchase order, this is a record saying that you intend to do something, or it's a commitment to do something. And in this case, it's a commitment to build something as opposed to purchase or sell something. So that's our work order. It has no financial impact. There's no general ledger impact at all. Then it goes straight over to an assembly build, which really just says that the thing was built. Meaning once you've saved the assembly build record, that thing now exists in the system as if it's already been totally completed. So as you can see, it would not be feasible for building a car because you can't simply say you want to build a car and then suddenly a car exists. But when you're baking cakes, it is much more feasible. You have a work order saying you want to build 10 carrot cakes, and then in a couple hours, you have 10 carrot cakes. You can simply go in the system, log that the assembly build was complete, and you now have those 10 carrot cakes. So very straightforward system, and all the general ledger impact is right in that assembly build. So with that framework in mind, let's actually walk through that process so you can see how it works in the system. So I'm going to come up here, and I have the option to create a new work order. So I'll click on that. We're going to leave our current page. And it brings me to this work order. So let's come up here and we're going to select our basic information like the subsidiary, etc. All right, and we can see that we're only going to be building one of this thing. In this case, you can see it's brake lights, but just imagine it's a cake for a second. And before we go any further down, I do want to point out the status is very important. So you have the option of setting it as planned or released. And basically what this is saying is planned is saying that this is something at some point in the future, you do intend to make this thing, but you haven't necessarily gotten to the point where you're like literally ready to build it. As opposed to released, which actually means, okay, good, we're ready to go. We're now going to bake this cake. This is not something that's going to happen and is scheduled for 2 months or a week in the future. We're making the cakes right now. So for the sake of this, we are going to set it as released. And moving down from that, you can see there's a number of other fields. None of these are mandatory fields, so I'm not going to dive too deep into them, but you can see the bill of materials, the BOM that is used, and which revision for that BOM is going to come into play for the manufacturing of this particular cake. So you can see we're using revision 1, we're fine with that. So we're going to come down here and you can see this is a very simple build. There's only one component. You might have one that has 15 components. There might be one that has 10 components, but some of those are assembly items and they have their own components. So you have sub-assemblies within your assembly. You could have all manner of different things. This is a very straightforward example. It's literally just taking one of this component item in the production of our carrot cake. You can also see information like how much is available of that component, what's on hand, etc. So we're good on that. We're going to come down here and we're going to save this record. All right, and we've now saved our work order. Now, one thing to just note is that because I set the status as released, we have this create build option. So this will take us to the assembly build. If I had set the status as planned, or I had left it as planned, we would not have the ability to create build. We'd be locked in at this point, basically having created the work order, but not yet able to progress until we go back into the work order, edit it so that it is released, and then we have that button available. So because we have it available and we are ready to go, we're going to make our cake. We're going to hit create build. And this draws all the information that we already put on our work order. It simply pulls it over to the assembly build. Much like if you had a sales order, once you go to that item fulfillment, it brings over all that information. So you can see we've got everything we need. Quantity to build is 1. Now we could change that if we want. Maybe we intended to build 1, but for whatever reason, maybe the cakes were smaller, we ended up building 2. We could put anything down that we needed to. But for the sake of this, everything is fine. We simply need to set what the location is. So we intended to build something, but now we've actually built it and it's built in Los Angeles. So we've got all that. We're going to come down. We have all the information that we want in place, but there's one additional thing I want to point out, because most companies are going to have this. If you look on the right here, this inventory detail column is currently blank, but for most companies, you're going to have either bin management or you're going to have quality statuses associated with items. So for a cake, you want to show that you made a cake and it was a good cake, not one that had to be thrown away. So in that case, if you have any of those different features enabled, you would have a little box here that you'd have to click on. You'd have to say, what bin this is going to, or maybe what lot was created with this item, or what quality status the final item has. You'd have to set that first, and it would be a little checkbox on your cube to notify that that's all good. You have your inventory details set up. In this particular case, none of those features are on this demo account. So we're good to go. We can hit save on this record. Just like that, assembly 37, which is our assembly item, we've now produced one of those, in this case, carrot cakes. So just like that, with just a few steps, that is really the simplicity of the non-whip system. You've got a work order saying you intend to make something, and then you produce it. Very straightforward, very easy to understand, and easy to execute. So that's as deep as we're going to go into manufacturing in this video. As I mentioned earlier, I will be coming out with a full manufacturing course in just a couple weeks that will dive not only more in detail on path 1, but we'll also go into path 2, WIP, which is significantly more complicated, as well as the outsourced manufacturing path. So if any of that is interesting to you, by all means, take advantage of it, and I'll see you in the next video.